Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So in light of the release, finally, of the highly anticipated by some Snyder Cut, I thought it would be a fun-ish, an interesting at least idea to go through my thoughts on the DCEU as a whole. And here, as you can probably tell from the title, we will be discussing some of the issues and problems that have plagued this franchise. And most importantly, why I think those issues have arisen and what the DCEU could do in order to fix these problems. And I did think that this would be an especially fitting video to do upon the release of the Snyder Cut this week, because obviously the Snyder Cut in and of itself is one of the symptoms of the issues that have plagued this franchise overall. However, having said all of that, I really need to start off this video with a massive disclaimer, because already a lot of people are so put off about talking about the DCEU online because of how intense and how threatening some fans can be when it comes to this franchise. There are some very dedicated fans of the DCEU who refuse to see any negativity surrounding this franchise, and they will make that very, very clear. So I would just say this, okay? If you can't handle the idea of even seeing someone talk negatively about this franchise, then literally just click off. Like, it's really not that deep. Just click off. This is not the video for you. Find another channel that praises the DCEU. There are plenty of them. But if you're here to see an analytical breakdown of the issues that have plagued the DCEU and how they could perhaps move forward in the future, then this is the video for you, as well as some, colorful commentary here and there from a Marvel fan. I'm just joking. Do keep in mind that whilst I am a big fan of the MCU, I like to take an analytical perspective on everything. All kinds of films, all kinds of TV shows. You can probably see from the length of my videos that I like to look at things from different perspectives. So this isn't just going to be me, bashing on the DCEU. This is going to be about getting to the bottom of some of the issues that it actually has and trying to make sense of how it's affected the franchise overall as of yet and what it could potentially be in the future. So if all of that sounds good to you, then I hope you enjoy this video, and if you do, don't forget to give it a like, and please be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. But without further ado, let's dive into some of my thoughts on the problems with the DCEU. So the DCEU, aka the DC Extended Universe, is a comic book movie franchise that was developed by Warner Brothers in response to the MCU, which we'll talk about later on, and they center around the characters from DC Comics, these legendary superhero characters that have been around for decades. In 2013, Warner Brothers released Man of Steel, which would become the first entry into the DCEU slate. Now, this film was directed by Zack Snyder, and it was written by David S. Goyer and Christopher Nolan. Now, the Christopher Nolan part is interesting because, of course, Warner Brothers was coming off of the coattails of the huge success that was Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. And as a result, because of that major success that franchise ended up being, that very much dictated the look and feel of the upcoming DCEU world, which acted as a counter to Disney's MCU. Now, what's interesting here is that actually the first entry into the DCEU was supposed to be 2011's Green Lantern, but that all changed when the film ended up being what it was, okay? It ended up being a colossal flop, both financially and also with critics and audiences. So of course, Warner Brothers ended up shifting gears, turning towards Man of Steel, that would be directed by Zack Snyder, as I said, and that would end up being the first entry into their new DCEU. As of today, as I'm filming this, there have been 9 DCEU feature films that have been released, excluding the director's cut of Batman vs Superman, or also known as the Ultimate Edition, and of course excluding the upcoming Snyder Cut of Justice League. Now, what's key to note here, and this is something that we will definitely be talking about later on, is that the original plan was to have Zack Snyder be the director of 5 films that would feature various DC superhero characters. These would be standalone films, and eventually they would lead up to an Avengers style reunion type film. But in 2017, DC Films decided to de-emphasize the shared nature of the universe in order to allow for more autonomy for the individual filmmakers. Now, This is the reason that they gave. But I have to say that a huge factor of this was, of course, the critical and audience reception, and of course the box office of the Snyderverse films not being great. Okay, we're going to be talking about that, like I said, later on. But just keep in mind that the original plan was to have Zack Snyder be the center, the core of the DCEU, with the 5 films that he would have directed, and then everything would kind of grow from there. But things changed as these films started to be released and as people started to react negatively to them. And finally, the last piece of trivia that I have here is that the DCEU is the 11th highest grossing film franchise of all time, having grossed over $5.6 billion at the global box office. Its highest grossing film, funnily enough, is Aquaman, which made over $1.15 billion worldwide, making it the highest grossing DC film of all time as of yet. Now that we've gone through some of the background information and we have a better understanding of the context of this franchise, it's time to go through some of the actual problems that I think have been holding the DCEU back. So first off, we're starting right at the very top with leadership. Now in 2018, it was announced that Walter Hamada would be taking on the role of the president of DC Films and the co-runner of the DCEU. The following month, Chantel Nong was named the vice president of DC Films, and the pair were hired to oversee the franchise along with Jeff Johns. Now, Jeff Johns is a very interesting character for multiple reasons that we will not be delving into in much detail in this video. But just to know that in June of 2018, Johns was fired from all of his executive roles at DC due to some disturbing allegations about his conduct. It's a whole situation. Like I said, we don't have time to delve into it in this video, but that was a huge deal because he was supposed to be the comics anchor for the DCEU. But unfortunately, due to his conduct and due to, a whole bunch of investigations that took place internally, he was kicked out from his executive role over the DCEU. And honestly, he is not the first or even the last problematic character that has emerged from the studio through this franchise. And honestly, we're not going to be delving into all of that drama here because it's very serious legal drama with very serious repercussions. But all of this is just to say that one of the problems with the leadership behind the DCEU is that it has generated a lot of negative press over the years because of the issues that it has faced internally. But another major issue that the leadership in the DCEU has is, of course, the competitor, the man who shall not be named, Kevin Feige. Let's talk about it. Okay, let's go through this because this is a very important point of difference that I think the DCEU suffers from. It is without question that Kevin Feige has become one of the most successful and honestly inspirational producers in the last decade. Hands down, his work with the MCU is legendary and will go down in Hollywood history. But of course, when you have such a successful model as we see with the MCU, there are inevitably going to be competitors that spring up and try to copy that model. But the problem here is that it seems as though that the DCEU has been trying to copy the wrong things, because what it really should prioritize is getting a leader just like Kevin Feige. It is so crucial to have a leader behind a franchise of this scale that can provide the franchise with the same qualities that Kevin Feige does as their producer. And if you're wondering exactly what these qualities are, well, first of all, DC desperately needs a producer that is business savvy, hands down. Okay, that is without question. And of course, we seem to have that in Walter Hamada, who seems to have an understanding of franchise building. As I said, he was very successful with the Conjuring franchise. But I think, once again, considering how huge the scale of these superhero franchises is, we do also need someone who has a little bit more knowledge surrounding, franchise world building at that scale and blockbuster filmmaking, which is something that Walter Hamada didn't really encounter in his work with the Conjuring franchise. I think it is crucial for the DCEU to have a producer who understands blockbuster filmmaking in order to gain as much broad appeal, full quadrant appeal for their films, so that you can reach as much of an audience as possible. And hopefully, as a result, you would just be raking in those box office dollars. And on top of this, I strongly believe that it is crucial for a franchise like the DCEU DCEU to have a member of their leadership be incredibly passionate and really love the source material, or if they don't love it, at least have an appreciation of it and an appreciation of the fans that have dedicated so much of their love and their time towards the source material of their works. This is so key. We have seen multiple examples of major producers who just have not had an understanding of, or have not really been able to click with, the fan base of the particular source material or of the particular franchise. Yes, I'm talking about Kathleen Kennedy and Star Wars, whatever, we're not talking about that today. But it is so crucial to have that symbiotic relationship between the source material and the fans and the films. I think that's the best way forward when you want to build a franchise to this scale, because you're going to need those core fans that love the source material, that are most hyped for these films, in order to generate that buzz that, you know, more casual fans won't necessarily have. And then when it reaches the casual fans and you create more, you know, very passionate fans for your franchise, that's when you know you struck gold. That's when you know you are making the big bucks. Now, the collection of these traits and qualities basically amounts to a producer that has a vision, an overall vision for both the financial and also the creative. And this is what makes Kevin Feige so special. And that is the struggle that Warner Brothers has, is that they don't have an equivalent to him, but I think that they should be working far harder to get one, or at least a team that would basically encompass a Kevin Feige. Now, to be fair, they did attempt to do this by hiring someone like Jeff Johns, who, like I said, has his roots in the comics and was very successful there as well. But at the same time, first of all, being successful in the comics realm does not automatically translate to being successful with film. And secondly, unfortunately, as I mentioned, he does have a lot of personal issues and conduct issues that has clouded his experience over at the DCEU. So whilst he's still associated with other DC media, he's kind of been kicked off of the DCEU overall. And so we need someone else. So next up, we have problem number 2, and it is the race to the finish line. This is one of the key issues that has plagued the DCEU from its very genesis, because from its very genesis, it has been trailing behind its biggest competitor, yes, in the MCU. Because whilst Warner Brothers found huge success with Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, the same year that The Dark Knight itself, largely considered one of the best superhero films of all time, was released, the baby MCU was born in the form of 2008's Iron Man, which meant that Warner Brothers didn't even have time to bask in the success of The Dark Knight before they were headed towards a completely different path that had never been done before. Now, as Warner Brothers was already trailing behind when it came to developing their own MCU style superhero franchise, there was this added pressure that the MCU didn't have of trying to replicate the success of the MCU as the films went on. There was this intense and palpable pressure for Warner Brothers to try and catch up to the MCU and make up for lost time, even though, as I already said, the official first film of the DCEU was released in 2013, making the studio 5 years behind. So as a result of this, we did see Warner Brothers make some pretty questionable and, in hindsight, regrettable creative decisions, and a lot of that centered around rushing the franchise as quickly as possible. First of all, whilst the DCEU wanted to replicate the success of the MCU, it didn't necessarily want to take the time to replicate the model by which the MCU had gained their success. Instead of taking the time to build up the individual characters that would eventually lead to being the members of the Justice League, they decided to race ahead towards the Justice League as quickly as possible, with more than half of the team being completely underdeveloped, as their entry into the DCEU was in the reunion film, the film that was supposed to come together and bring the characters that we know and love together in one film and in one fight, as with the first Avengers film in 2012. And as a result, like I said, we saw a bunch of questionable decisions being made in order to race ahead to the finish line and try to replicate the success of its competitor, but obviously with less than perfect results, with most of the films ending up having a mixed to negative critical and and audience reception, and with the film seeing a decline for the most part in their box office success as well. Now, another symptom of the lack of vision in the leadership behind the DCEU is that as a result, they largely had to be quite reactionary to a lot of the films that were released and were met with these mixed to negative receptions, both financially and in terms of their creative qualities. For example, if you had a film that did underperform and did receive quite negative critical reception, i.e. Batman vs Superman, it also ended up impacting the next film following on, even if it wasn't strictly part of the same kind of mini franchise within the overall cinematic universe, as was the case for Suicide Squad, which had to be rewritten and reshot within a matter of weeks before its release. And again, these measures were largely reactionary, and you see a difference in the way that the MCU have handled similar situations. For example, it is largely thought that Iron Man 2 is one of the worst films in the entire franchise. I completely agree with that personally, but that didn't stop Iron Man 3 from being made. Iron Man 3 was still made, but it had a different director, it had a different creative team, and as a result it ended up being a marginally better film. But then we also see this to even greater success with the Thor franchise, with Thor the Dark World, largely considered to be not one of the best entries into the MCU, but then you had a complete shift with Taika Waititi taking on the Thor franchise and making it his own, and now it's a huge success, and it's actually going on to break the formula and have a fourth entry into the franchise. So instead of just completely giving up, throwing in the towel on a franchise because of one bad entry, Marvel under Kevin Feige decided to shift gears creatively instead of the overall vision and the overall path that he has carved for the franchise. And we know that these are very deliberate decisions that are made by Kevin Feige, because we see the reverse. We see when a director has done a good job, as is the case with Jon Favreau with Iron Man 1, or the case with James Gunn with Guardians of the Galaxy 1, and Taika Waititi and Ryan Coogler, who are currently working on the sequels to their films as well. So we see the reverse happening, where if a director or a creative team does a good job, they're able to stay on with the franchise, and that's kind of a nod of approval from Kevin Feige to go ahead. I mean, we saw how the Russo brothers dealt with Captain America Civil War, and then of course the Infinity War saga, and that's the power of having a leader like Kevin Feige who's able to oversee the creatives below him on each of their projects. Although the only exception to this rule, the only exception of kind of filtering out mediocrity would have to be Peyton Reed and the Ant-Man franchise. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't understand why he's still there. He must be the nicest person in the world. He must be so nice that Kevin Feige can't bring himself to fire him, because otherwise everyone else had to go. Why him? Why is he still on board? Now, yet another symptom of the DCEU lacking a long-term vision and also being quite reactionary as a result is the fact that there have been a ton of projects that have been announced and just never came to fruition. We heard about it until we didn't. For example, we have Justice League Dark, we have the Cyborg movie, the Deathstroke movie, the Justice League sequels that were announced in 2014. 3 years before the actual film came out. We have Gotham City Sirens, we have The New Gods that was supposed to be directed by Ava DuVernay, although I haven't heard much from that either. All of these projects that have since been either cancelled or just delayed over and over again. I mean, if you want to talk about delays, we can talk about the Flash movie. We can talk about the Flash movie. It's tough, and it is a symptom of the DCEU trying to race ahead, planning all of these projects before it's even seen a fraction of its films actually be released and actually go through that critical response that would determine how to move forward next. So now, after seeing the whirlwind and after seeing the roller coaster ride that has been the release of these DCEU films, as well as seeing some incredible success stories like that of Aquaman, the CEO of Warner Brothers, Kevin Sujihara, did say that the primary focus of the DC slate as of right now is to focus on individual stories as opposed to creating a shared universe that was initially designed to rival that of Marvel's. However, I will say, considering this new agenda, it is sending a little bit of mixed messaging when you do have the release of the Snyder Cut coming up within days from now. But that is a very different situation. I think we all understand that. And speaking of Zack Snyder himself, let's get into problem number 3. So whilst I've been talking a lot about how the DCEU leadership has lacked vision and has lacked, long-term foresight for the franchise and has failed to create a path forward for the franchise that it could stick to, that it could model all of the entries of the franchise by, that isn't strictly 100% true, I guess. I mean, it's like 99% true, but there was somewhat of a vision, except instead of that vision coming from the producer, the leader of the overall franchise, it was supposed to come from Zack Snyder. Because yes, as I mentioned earlier, the DCEU was initially supposed to be a Snyderverse. It was initially supposed to be centered around works that would be directed by Zack Snyder and would kind of set the tone for the overall franchise. Now, this tone was largely influenced by the successful Christopher Nolan Dark Knight trilogy, which countered Marvel's more family-friendly, light-hearted tone with more dark and gritty and dark and philosophical and dark and broody and desaturated. Warner Brothers decided to counter Marvel's aesthetic with a more dark and gritty tone in the DC films, which, to be fair, does suit a lot of the DC characters, but not all of them, okay? Not all of them. And therein lies the first problem with creating a Snyderverse, a whole DCEU centered around Zack Snyder's work, is that while Zack Snyder is a visionary director, there's no disputing that point. And I appreciate visionary directors who have that particular stamp to their work, that have that particular quality to their work where you recognize that that is a work of a Zack Snyder or that is a work of a Christopher Nolan. I appreciate that. I really do appreciate a director who has that unique vision and is able to bring that to franchise filmmaking. However, the problem with dedicating an entire cinematic universe to one guy's vision, okay, a vision that is very specific, a vision that is very distinct, is that first of all, those who don't like that vision and those who don't like that aesthetic will be drawn away from that cinematic universe as a whole, as opposed to just being drawn away to a franchise within the cinematic universe or even just an entry within it. And that's ultimately what happened with a lot of people. Whilst Man of Steel got, pretty mixed to positive reviews, you saw the bombing of Batman vs Superman, which failed to make $1 billion at the box office, even though it was pretty much guaranteed because of the subject matter. And of course, you also saw this being leaked into the Suicide Squad, with only Wonder Woman, 1 out of the 4, being the universally successful entry into the Snyderverse. And even then, that ending, the last third of Wonder Woman, where you have the distinct tropes of a Snyderverse DC film very present, okay? The desaturation, the CGI, okay? The ugly monsters that are featured there. Like, you have all of the Snyderisms in that final act of Wonder Woman, and it's the least interesting, least aesthetically pleasing, just most horrible part of that film, which is quite unfortunate because the rest of it was so distinctively Patty Jenkins. And the second problem with having a director who would basically lead the creative side of a cinematic universe is, as I mentioned earlier, in the case of the MCU, which has Kevin Feige as its leader, he can go ahead and decide, depending on the reception and the box office result, which directors and writers can proceed on to further entries into the franchise and into the cinematic universe overall, making sure that it's still kept fresh, okay, it's still kept interesting, with little pockets of the franchise looking quite unique, like how the Guardians of the Galaxy looks distinctly different to the Captain America films, which look distinctly different to the Black Panther film, etc, etc. Whereas when you have a director at the helm of an entire cinematic universe in terms of its, creativity, you would also reach the problem where the franchise would become quite stale and quite repetitive and redundant, as this person's vision is used throughout the entirety of the cinematic universe. I mean, people complain about the MCU being monotonous as hell, but I challenge you to imagine Zack Snyder making 22 films 22 films as a part of the DCEU. You want to talk about monotonous? You want to talk about stale? And the last issue with the Snyderverse is, as I alluded to earlier on, the problem with dedicating the entire franchise to one director's specific vision is that some people may not like it. And I happen to be one of those people. Listen, the time has come for me to just complain. This isn't based on facts or figures, just my personal opinion on Zack Snyder's work. Even though I do very much appreciate, like I said, a visionary director, I personally think that Zack Snyder is more of a cinematographer. He is an excellent cinematographer, not as much of an excellent director in my opinion, because I do think that he is all style and no substance whatsoever. Literally, like, first of all, his style in and of itself isn't my favorite, okay? The dark and gritty, the desaturation, the use of, you know, blue to contrast against orange, that is so obvious and overdone at this point. Like, try something new. I'm really not a fan of some of the visuals that Snyder came up with for the DCEU. I think it looks grimy. I think it looked quite monotonous and repetitive, as I mentioned, and also just not aesthetically pleasing to my eye anyway. I enjoy color. I enjoy the full spectrum of color. And so obviously the Snyderverse was never going to be my best friend. And also, whilst I understand Warner Brothers trying to chase after the success of Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, I don't agree with the assertion that dark and gritty automatically means more mature, more intellectual, and more deep. Like, that's not that really isn't the case, because you need to bring in that depth. You need to insert that level of intellect and the layers of, you know, social commentary and philosophical commentary that needs to be placed into the film by the director and by the writers. It's not enough to just have a dark and gritty aesthetic in order to convey that the film needs to be taken more seriously. That is very surface level. And that's what I mean when I say that Zack Snyder is all style and no substance, because whilst films like Batman vs Superman try their darndest, try their real hardest to be taken seriously by these, you know, long philosophical soliloquies that are said by Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor, who's one of my least favorite characters to be put on screen ever, just ever, okay? Even though it tries its darndest to be presented as a deep philosophical film with these discussions taking place, at the end of the day, it really isn't. Like, it really isn't. We're not even delving into philosophy 101 with a lot of the discussions that I had with Batman vs Superman. And yes, we see the Jesus imagery that is used in association with Superman. We see it. Like, we know. We get it, okay? It isn't intellectually above us, as some of the Batman vs Superman stans claim. Like, it's all very surface level, okay? It's not that complex. It's really not as deep as you think it is. And unfortunately, I do think that while Zack Snyder may have been the perfect director to turn to create the cinematic universe that Warner Brothers had in mind, that would counter the MCU in terms of his visuals and in terms of his aesthetics, I don't think that he was the right director to bring on in order to bring these films the substance and the depth that Warner Brothers was likely looking for. Now, having said all of that, I understand that Zack Snyder has his fans. He has his very passionate, okay, very vocal fans, and I completely get that. I don't hold anything against him personally. I'm just talking about his works and how I respond to them. And I also understand the passion, okay, and the work that was done by the fans in order to make the Snyder cut of Justice League happen in the first place, okay, because it was a lot of work, okay? So much had to happen in order for fans to finally get through to Warner Brothers and make the Snyder cut possible. And I completely understand the passion behind that by fans. But I am quite wary, okay? I am quite afraid by this new movement that's come about where fans are starting to petition for a new Snyderverse after the possibility of the Snyder cut. I think that would be a huge mistake by Warner Brothers, okay? Because at the end of the day, there's a reason why the box office was diminishing for these Snyderverse films. There's a reason why these films were not critically acclaimed and were not loved by the majority of people, to the point where the films would see a diminishing returns, okay? Clearly, the majority of people did not respond well to Snyder's vision of the DCEU, and I think to only hear the voices of the most vocal all fans of the Snyderverse would be a mistake. Now, having said this, if the Snyder Cut does end up being a huge success for Warner Brothers, then all bets are off, okay? Because the numbers don't lie. Clearly, there would be a huge fan base behind the Snyderverse, and it would warrant a kind of redo, perhaps, or maybe even a revisiting in just HBO Max, you know, something along those lines, perhaps to a smaller scale so that, you know, expectations would be lower if he was even up for that. But in terms of trying to reboot the Snyderverse or trying to continue on down the path that was set out in 2013, I think that would be a huge mistake, because I think that Warner Brothers is doing the right thing by kind of diversifying its portfolio and taking a look at different kinds of filmmakers and different kinds of projects to lead the way. As Kevin Tsujihara said, you know, trying to divest from the shared universe model that Marvel has done so successfully, but that DC hasn't been able to replicate, and certainly not under Zack Snyder's creative control. And speaking of diversifying the DCEU portfolio, let's move on to problem number 4. Now, this is just something that has really bugged me for a very, very long time when it comes to the DCEU. For the longest time, the DCEU, okay, the universe of DC, has largely been limited to just Batman and Superman. Literally, we have seen Batman film after Batman film after Batman film after Superman film after Superman film after Batman film. Like, why are they the only two characters that the franchise can do? Like, why are they the only two characters that the franchise cares about? I've never understood this, because here's the thing: when it comes to the MCU, due to, you know, Marvel's financial circumstances in the early noughties, which we can get into in a completely different video, they were left with B-list, C-list characters, as their A-list characters like the Fantastic Four and the X-Men were owned by other studios like Fox, or in the case of Spider-Man, owned by Sony. So they were forced to make do with what they had, with characters like Iron Man and the Hulk and, you know, the rest of the Avengers, as well as some very obscure characters like the Guardians of the Galaxy. Like, they had to make it work. They had to make it work, okay? And the thing is, and what I find particularly admirable, is that they did, okay? Because for a lot of these characters, their first iterations on screen are in the MCU. We'd never had an Ant-Man film before, and now a lot of us enjoy the character of Ant-Man because of his portrayal by Paul Rudd. We'd never really seen Iron Man on screen before, but now he's an iconic comic book movie character because of his portrayal by Robert Downey Jr. So my question is, why doesn't DC copy that? I never understood why for the longest time DC just refused to broaden their horizons and only stuck to the same old Batman, Superman films. Like, really? Is that all you can do? I mean, we literally got our first Wonder Woman film like ever in 2017, and yet we've been getting Batman films from like the 50s, like literally the last century. I think that there have been so many missed opportunities when it comes to DC characters, and Warner Brothers dipping into this huge well of DC characters and worlds in DC that it could dip into in order to create franchises out of them. And I understand that the reasoning seems to be that because Batman and Superman are some of the most recognizable characters of all time, you're pretty much guaranteed to have some financial success due to their brand recognition. But in the case of the MCU, as I said, they created brand recognition in the characters that are now depicted on screen in order to give audiences much more variety and a broader range of characters to become invested in, so that their franchise again diversifies its portfolio and doesn't end up being so reliant on the success of a Batman film or a Superman film or even a Batman versus Superman film, which still should have made $1 billion, having said all of that. Now, to be fair, there was a visible attempt by Warner Brothers in order to make this happen as they were building the shared universe, but because of the problems that I've already listed, that was met with a lot of challenges, and as a result we have seen the building of the shared universe be stalled, and therefore the potential to mine the huge lore, the huge wealth of characters that DC has, almost entirely wasted. So now that I've outlined some of the issues that I've identified that the DCEU has been facing, I did want to end off this video on a little bit more of a positive note and I did want to mention a few things that the DCEU DCEU has done very, very well. So here goes. I'm trying to be positive here, guys. So first of all, we do have the casting. I think one of the best things that the Snyderverse and the DCEU did was in its casting of the characters, because I truly think that Henry Cavill as Superman is one of the best casting decisions that has been made in the last decade, like easily. And so that's why it's so upsetting to see the wasted potential in the character and Henry Cavill's performance of that character. But whatever, we need to be positive. Okay, I promised that I would be. I do think that the casting decisions for the most part have been excellent in the DCEU. And secondly, I do think that the DCEU did have the right idea with the multiverse. Now, both Marvel and DC have played around with multiverses plenty in the comics, so it makes sense to translate that to the films and TV shows. But the DCEU, to be fair, did explicitly mention the multiverse first in its Arrowverse shows, and to much success. I enjoyed seeing the characters from all of these different worlds in these Elseworld stories in the Arrowverse specials. So I do think that it is a great idea to introduce into the DCEU the idea of multiverses, and that has of course long been said to be a part of the Flash movie storyline, with Flashpoint happening. That could potentially reboot the entire franchise. I don't know what it's going to end up doing now. However, to be fair, unfortunately, because of the delays that surrounded the Flash film, it looks as though the MCU is actually going to beat the DCEU with the multiverse storylines, starting with Spider-Man 3 later this year. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on the problems that plague the DCEU, it's time for you guys to let me know what your thoughts are on this franchise down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!